Hello, this is Charles Bernard, the illustrator. I paint science fiction and fantasy book covers as well as book covers for other genres. With this video, you'll get some idea of the importance of knowing what it is that makes a good shape. This is a full-length art lesson on shapes, which is part of the fundamentals that you need to learn if you don't know the fundamentals. The fundamentals are learned best through an art school, by taking an entire art course. Because there's so much to learn, you can't learn them by watching a few videos. It's necessary to take an entire art course that focuses on these fundamentals, which the Online Art Academy does. So, let's begin. What you see here is a drawing that I did in which I was analyzing a painting done by the great Sid Mead. And I want to show you how he uses shapes to make an interesting picture through creating interesting shapes. And you'll be learning the rules for interesting shapes in this video. This large, dark shape was broken up by introducing the light shapes that you see here. But over here, there's still quite a large dark shape that can be made more interesting and that can help to lead the eye into the painting. And what Sid Mead does is he introduces these lines here that break up this large dark shape here. And these lines move or lead the eye into the painting. This one too. And also you can see that now this dark shape has been made more interesting by introducing these light lines that cut across the shape and divide it. But what he also does, in order to connect this shape with this one, he introduces a dark shape right here that acts as a kind of linkage with the other shape. When creating links or connections between shapes, they don't always have to be substantial. They can be rather tenuous and still give the feeling that the shapes are connected. I'm going to enlarge this section so that I can show you some of the tenuous connections of these dark shapes. And you can see it right here, right here, right here, right here. They're not very substantial connections, but nevertheless, they still connect. And by doing this, you avoid getting a lot of disconnected shapes that create a scattered look. And this helps to hold the shapes together. Now, not all shapes need to be connected. You can have some that are disconnected from the married shapes or connected shapes. And these disconnected shapes help to add interest to the design, and you can use them to balance the married shapes or connected shapes, the larger group shapes. And this is what Sid Mead has done. These shapes are not connected to the main shapes over here. They're separate, they're disconnected, but they're placed in close proximity, but the proximity is close enough so that a scattered look is avoided. It is, however, advisable that you try to tie in or connect as many shapes as possible, with a few disconnected ones for interest and balance, but don't disconnect too many of them, because then you're in danger of creating a composition that is disconnected and scattered, that doesn't have an easy eye flow, that is, passage from one shape to another. The eye will be jumping from one shape to the other, instead of flowing. Now I'm only using the dark shapes in this painting to show you what makes a good shape and what makes it interesting. But what I'm showing you with these dark shapes can be applied to your light shapes or your middle tone shapes. It doesn't matter. The principles remain the same. Now, Sid Mead creates a lot of interest through the variety of sizes of shapes that he uses. All of these small shapes here contrast sharply in size with these larger, dark shapes on the left. And this extreme contrast in sizes of shapes helps to add a tremendous amount of interest to this design. Now, these little lines and spots and dots and shapes that you see here that he sprinkles around, they help to add a lot of interest to the larger shapes through their extreme contrast in sizes. When you add these kind of lines and spots and small shapes that you see here, they're referred to as calligraphy. And this kind of calligraphy can add a tremendous amount of interest to the larger, more simple shapes. I'm going to eliminate this calligraphy to show you what the shapes look like without them. I think that now the shapes are not as interesting as when the calligraphy is applied. Don't you think that this looks more interesting than this? So these little spots and lines and dots and shapes add a lot of interest. These smaller shapes are the detail, and they draw the eye of the viewer here because of the busy pattern that they create. And they contrast nicely with the larger, more quiet shapes. Now I'm going to show you the kind of shape that should be avoided. And it's this kind, which is a symmetrical shape. If I draw a line down the center, the left side of the shape is the same as the right side. And these kind of shapes make the most boring kind of shapes. A more interesting shape is a shape that is asymmetrical. If I draw a line down the center, you can see that the left side of the shape is different from the right side of the shape. And these are the kind of shapes that you should try to create because they are the most interesting. They avoid monotony, the repetition of the left side on the right side. I'm going to show you a boring shape. This is a building, and it's not interesting. Now, how do you make a shape interesting? Well, I'm going to show you. This boring shape here needs to be changed, and the changes that will make it interesting will be as follows. First of all, there needs to be an oblique directional movement within the shape. Here, there are only horizontals and verticals. Horizontal and then verticals. And also, the shape is too square. A square is a boring shape because all the sides of the square are of equal length. And also, the axis of this shape down the middle has the same dimension as the width. Once I go through changing this shape, then I'll show you how it relates to what Sidney did. Now, an interesting shape needs to have two different dimensions. The length must be different than the height, or the height must be different than the length. Now I'll eliminate these red lines and change the dimensions. By making the shape wider, I've increased the interest of this shape because now the length is different than the height is. And these two different dimensions help to make the shape a little more interesting. The shape, however, still is a very boring shape, and a lot more needs to be done to it to make it really interesting. This shape is even more interesting than the previous shape because of the obliques or diagonals that I added to the shape. These diagonals help to increase the interest, and they give a feeling of movement, make the shape more dynamic. Now I'll bring back the previous shape, and I think you'll agree that this previous shape is not as interesting as the shape with the obliques. The oblique shape also has form, and the previous shape is flat. So the addition of form to the shape adds even more interest. When I say form, I'm referring to the feeling of solidity that this shape has. The feeling of a third dimension, a solid look to it. It has height, width, and depth, which this one lacks. It only has height and width, and therefore it's flat looking. This shape, however, is still not interesting enough. More needs to be done. As you can see, this shape is even more interesting than the previous one. Now, the reason it's more interesting is, first of all, when you create what's called incidence at the edge of a shape. You see these shapes here. They are pushing into the negative space, and the negative space is pushing into the positive shape. So you have this opposing movement, like that. And these incidents at the edge of a shape, where these little lines and shapes push into the negative space, they add a lot of interest to a shape. I'm going to bring back the previous shape to show you how dull this shape looks in comparison to this shape. Because here, there are no incidents at the edge of the shape, like there are here. The edge is dull. All of these edges are dull. But once you start adding these little shapes that are pushing into the negative space, then you start adding interest to the shape. Now what this also does is it creates a shape that interlocks with the negative space. If you check out Volume 5 in this Art Track video series, you'll find a section in that video in which I talk a lot about how to interlock shapes. I highly suggest that you take a look at that volume. But of course, I'll also mention how to interlock shapes here. But I go into it more extensively in Volume 5. What also makes this more interesting is the addition of these smaller shapes. They contrast in size with this larger shape. And this contrast of sizes of the additional shapes helps to add even further interest. I'm going to bring back one of the other shapes that I showed you earlier to point something out to you. Another reason why this shape is more interesting than this shape is because one part of this shape is larger than another part. Here in this shape, this size is exactly the same as this size. But in this shape, this size is larger than this size. It's like this shape here. This part of the shape is larger and this is smaller. And therefore, it's much more interesting than a shape that looks like this, where there isn't this difference in sizes between one part of the shape and another part. To further increase the interest of your shapes, they need to be interlocked one with the other and with the negative space. This shape does not interlock with the surrounding negative space, and therefore it's not as interesting as this shape that does interlock with the negative space surrounding it. And the way this shape interlocks with the negative space is by cutting into the shape, like you see here, or through these projections or incidents, as they're sometimes called, that push into the negative space. I'm going to interlock this shape with its background by cutting into the shape like that, and then creating a projection or an incidence at the edge of this shape, something like that, and another one here, smaller one. Now by doing this, I've interlocked this shape with its background, with the negative space that surrounds it. And already the shape has become a little more interesting because of this. If you create shapes that are like this one, where you do not find any kind of intrusion of the negative space into the positive shape like I'm doing now. You see, if this sort of intrusion doesn't occur somewhere on the shape, then there's no way that you can interlock that shape with its background. In addition, create these projections or incidents at the edge of a shape that push into the negative space, thereby further interlocking the positive shape with the negative space and background. If you create two shapes such as these rectangles here, and you bring them together and overlap them, they do not interlock one with the other. Neither do they interlock with the surrounding negative space. These are the kind of shapes, as I've already mentioned, that should be avoided. They don't make interesting shapes. But if you create something like this, you see, when I bring these two shapes together, one interlocks with the other. But they don't interlock with the negative space surrounding it. So what needs to be done is I have to cut into that shape, push into the shape with the negative space, like that. Now it's interlocking with its background as well as with its neighboring shape. And I can do the same thing here with the black shape. By pushing into the black shape with the negative space. Now the shapes interlock one with the other as well as with the surrounding negative space. And now moving right along, to make this shape even more interesting, I'm going to add some calligraphy. These are the lines and dots and small shapes that I mentioned earlier that Sid Mead uses in his painting. And I've added a few disconnected shapes. Let me change that to red. Here are the disconnected shapes, and here are the lines, spots, and dots, and small shapes that are the calligraphy that activate the shape, enliven it, animate it, make it even more interesting than it was previously. These small spots, lines, dots, and shapes, they contrast sharply with the larger shapes, and that's what helps to increase the interest of the larger shapes. In addition, the entire shape is oblique. It's not just that one part of the shape, such as this part, is oblique, or this edge here, but the entire shape is oblique. The entire direction of the shape is at an angle. This makes a shape more dynamic, gives it a feeling of movement. As you can see, I've turned this shape into a silhouette. The reason for this is so that you can more clearly see the rhythms of the shape. For a shape to be interesting and a unified shape, it needs to have a rhythm at the edge of the shape. A certain segment of the shape needs to be repeated and be repeated in varying sizes. For example, this segment here is repeated here, and here, and here, and here, and here. It sets up a rhythm at the edge of the shape. This segment is larger than this segment, and this segment is smaller than this segment. So a variety of sizes of these segments exists. Now, there are only three basic shapes: the circle, the square, and the triangle. If, for example, I create a shape that has a triangular character to it, the segments of this shape are like this, you see? And those segments are repeated at the edge of the shape. This segment, this, And this sets up a rhythm. The repetition of a feature such as this, repeated in a variety of sizes, will add interest and rhythm to the shape. And it also makes a unified shape. This segment is much larger than this one is, and this one. And here's a small one over here. So you see, this variety of sizes is the kind of edge that you need to create to make the shape interesting. If I create a shape that has a rectangular character to it, then the segment will be rectangular. For example, this is the segment that's repeated. And here's a large one, or it could be down here, smaller one. So a large one, a medium-sized one, and then a small one over here. And also there's one here like that, creating a unified shape. Then there is the shape that has a curving character to it, such as this one. And the segment repeated, of course, is the curve. This repetition of this curved segment gives the shape unity. I'd like to point out that you can combine these shapes. You don't have to have one shape that's completely made up of curves like this. You can have a curved shape with a rectangular part like that. But most of the shape needs to be curved. Otherwise, you do not wind up with a unified shape. Or it could be something like this, and then I add some triangular segments like these to the rectangular part of the shape. Combining these shapes makes for interesting shapes. But remember, you need to create a shape that is still a unified shape. And the way you do that is through dominance, which means that most of the shape needs to be of one character, and then a smaller part can be of a different character. In addition to what I have been saying about what makes shapes interesting, there is also the need to create a shape that has both an active and an inactive side, or a passive and an active side. And what I mean by that is that one side of a shape, this shape, for example, here, has greater irregularity. There is more activity on that side. There's more going on that side than the other side. Could add one more here, like that. So, you see there's a lot of irregularity here compared to the opposite side, which has very little irregularity. And because of that, the opposite side becomes the inactive or passive side, and this side is the active side. This contrast between active and passive sides of shape adds a lot of interest to the shape. It gives the shape a dynamic quality. It animates the shape. In this shape, this part of the shape is more active than this part. You see a lot of irregularity here. Not as much here. Therefore, this is the active side and this is the passive side, adding interest to the shape. Now, if you add a pattern to a shape, it helps to add more interest. For example, if I drew lines across like this, I'm setting up a pattern of lines. And as you can see, already the shape has become more interesting with the addition of this pattern. As you can see, I brought back this rough portrait sketch that I did to show you that if I added a pattern of lines here, I can make this little sketch even more interesting. See, something like that. So it really doesn't matter what kind of shape you're using, a portrait shape, a building like the shape here, or whatever the shape is. If you add a pattern, it will make the shape even more interesting. Now, I'd like to show you what else can be done to make shapes interesting. A gradation of value or color or texture, any of the design elements, if graded, such as a value, for example, within this shape, running from dark to light, will add interest to the shape. I've indicated gradation in this shape here, where this shape is. You see how it runs from dark to a lighter value, adding interest to this part of the larger shape. There are a few more things that I need to mention before I move on that will make the shape even more interesting. And one of them is that you need to create emphasis within a shape. That is, there should be one place where the eye of the viewer will be attracted to. That becomes the center of interest of the shape. And it will add a lot of interest to the shape. For example, if I add these shapes here, this becomes the area of emphasis within the shape that the eye can focus on. The eye needs a place where it can go and focus. Now, by adding this small area where the eye can focus, the entire shape becomes more interesting. If I take this away, you see, it's not as interesting as when I put that in there. So this is very important. A shape needs emphasis. In addition, adding texture to a shape will also enhance the shape and thereby make it even more interesting. And I've done that with the building, where I've indicated this texture here, here, and here. If I take it away, the shape isn't as interesting as when the texture is there. Now, also, if I add color, that too will increase the interest of the shape. But I'm not going to do that now. If you're able to apply all these things that I have shown you to your shapes, I think you'll find that your shapes will be much more interesting than if you hadn't applied these things to your shapes. I'm doing these examples in black and white and grayscale because color is really not necessary in order to show you what makes a great shape. I think it would just be distracting. Now I'd like to make some comparisons between this shape and the shapes by Sid Mead. For example, this part of the shape where these projections or incidents occur that push into the negative space and interlock the shape with its background can be seen here. These shapes push into the negative space and interlock this large shape with its background. Now also, where I cut into the shape, right here, you can see the same sort of cutting into the shape right here, 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 here. And this further helps interlock this large dark shape with its background. Here you see calligraphy, little spots, lines, and dots, and little shapes that help to activate the entire area. And you can see the same in Sid Mead's shapes, where these little spots, lines, dots, and shapes are added to activate the entire area. I used calligraphy, and he used calligraphy. I indicated a pattern here, and he indicated a pattern of lines here. This shape has obliques, or diagonals, and Sid Mead's shape has diagonals, or obliques. As you can see, I've eliminated the incidents at the edge of the shape to show you what the shape would look like if he had not indicated them. The shape wouldn't be interlocking with its background, and it wouldn't be very interesting. Now I'll return them. What a difference. Boring, interesting. not interlocking with its background, interlocking with its background. There's one more thing that needs to be done to the shapes to make them even more interesting, and that is to vary the edges along the shape so that they don't all look the same. Some edges need to be hard, some soft, some blurred, and some lost completely. And this variety of edges along the shape will add a tremendous amount of interest to your shapes. Now watch what happens when I start changing the edges to make them look different. Here, as you can see, I've lost the edge completely. There should be lost and found edges. The found edges are the ones that you can see, and the lost edges are the ones that have been completely eliminated, or that can hardly be seen because the values are so similar. This foreground value and this background value are the same, and therefore the edge is completely lost. Now I'll add another shape of value, and this value softens this edge. If I eliminate that value and return it to white, now the edge is much harder. Now it's been softened because of this value placed in back of this shape here. So you can vary the edges of a shape from softer to harder depending on the value that you place in back of that shape, like I did here. And now I'll change another edge. You can see it right here. I changed this one to a blurred edge. And by blurring that edge, it becomes very soft. Softer than by doing this, where I placed a darker value in back of this value. If you blur the edge, you get a very soft edge. So already I have three different kinds of edges: lost, soft, and blurred. I'll enlarge this section to show you the blurred edge, and also to let you know that there are different degrees of blurred edges. Some blurred edges may be harder than others. If I lighten this value somewhat, the blurred edge becomes a little harder. If I remove it, now it becomes very soft, as you can see. So there are different degrees of blurred edges. Keep that in mind when you're creating blurred edges. There are also different degrees of soft edges, like this one, depending on how dark or how light the value is that I placed in back of an edge like this. I'll show you an example over here by placing a dark shape there. Now, this dark shape is not as dark as this. You can see the edge here. And this edge has been softened because of this dark value that I placed in back of it. This edge is much softer than this edge because of the darker value that I placed behind it. So it depends on the degree of value that you place in back of an edge like this that determines how soft that edge is going to be. So now I have a lot of variety of edges, which adds a lot of interest to this shape. Keep your softer edges and blurred edges in the distance to create a feeling of depth, and the harder and sharper edges up front. The sharpest edge should be where you want the eye to focus. I just added this white shade here to create an even stronger contrast so that the eye will be attracted to this part of the shape. So right now, the eye is attracted to the inside of the shape because of this strong contrast of value here. But if I wanted the eye to be attracted to some part of the edge of this shape, here or here, for example, then I need to soften all of the other edges and keep one edge hard so that the eye will then be attracted to that part of the shape that has the hardest edge. As you can see, I've softened all of the edges except for a few edges right here that remain hard. compared to the other edges. This is where you find the strongest contrast of value, and therefore the hardest or sharpest edge. The eye will be attracted here because of this strong contrast, rather than to these other softer edges where the contrast is less. There's something I'd like to point out, and that is these two shapes here. This one looks more like a line, but it can also be considered a long, thin shape. And these two shapes connect with this shape here because they are both dark. And now I've come to the end of this video. In this video, I've tried to show you things that you normally are not being taught in most of the videos that are out there. Most of the videos that are out there focus usually on some kind of painting method or painting techniques, and that's not what is going to make you an artist. It's not what is going to enable you to paint better pictures or draw better pictures. That which is going to make it possible for you to paint the kind of picture that you admire are the fundamentals. They are an indispensable part of the learning process to become an artist. For without a knowledge of the fundamentals, you'll never be able to produce professional-looking work. So, it is these fundamentals that you must learn. And this video, focusing on shape, is one of those fundamentals. For without interesting and effective-looking shapes, your pictures are not going to be very effective. They're not going to be interesting. And now, so long.